Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to another live show. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong, and we have an incredible panel today, Garland Nixon, Colonel Wilkerson, and Scott Ritter. Before we get to them, though, let's just introduce the program. So Russian missiles and drones right now are raining down on Ukraine, hitting Kiev and Kharkov as mainstream media panics over Russia's intensifying offensive. Is Russia getting its retaliation for Ukraine's nuclear bomber attack? What does the future hold for the conflict as it moves toward its natural conclusion of Russian victory? Where is Trump in the United States in all of this? To answer these questions and much more, we have, of course, our special guests today. First, we have Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff and retired U.S. Army Colonel. Colonel Wilkerson, thanks for joining.
Good to be with you, Danny.
And we have Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector. He is the host of the Russia House, and you can find his Substack and his new YouTube channel in the link in the video description. Scott, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, and we have Garland Nixon. He is the host of his own YouTube show, which you can find in the video description. He's an analyst, longtime friend. Garland, thanks for joining again.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, of course. Well, let's get started. I wanted to play what the Russian negotiator, Mr. Medinsky, had to say on Rick Sanchez's show, because I think it shows where we are as the reports in Western mainstream media are covering the massive attacks on Kiev, as well as Russia's advances on the front line. So here is what Mr. Medinsky had to say on Rick Sanchez's show.
Indeed, our population, our citizens demand much harsher actions from us. It was very hard for us to go to the second round of negotiations when Ukraine deliberately, on the day of our departure, blew up a passenger train and civilians and children died.
So, Scott, how about we begin with you? Talk about what's been going on. Is this the retaliation? What's been happening in Kiev? There's been several days now of strikes. Russia's defense ministry says they are hitting the defense infrastructure of Kiev really hard at the moment, as well as making advances on the front lines. Is this the response to the bomber attack that occurred now, what was it, a week and a half ago? Talk about what's been going on.
Well, first of all, I just like to point when words matter, and when you say missiles and bombs raining down on Kiev, that implies a lack of precision. Because when I go outside and it's raining down, the rain just landing wherever the hell it wants to land. Every Russian munition is hitting a target that's been carefully selected by the Russian Ministry of Defense to achieve specific outcomes. These are targets that have legitimate military purpose, therefore they're legitimate military target. There's nothing haphazard in what Russia is doing. I believe that what we're seeing right now is the retaliation for the train attacks, because to retaliate for the drone attack on Russian strategic bombers, Russia needs to reset the notion of strategic deterrence. The Ukraine has violated that, so has Great Britain and to some extent the United States. Sergei Lavrov, in a recent statement, directly implicates the British and says that American involvement is either similarly direct or through inertia, meaning that it is part of a previous policy that hasn't been brought to an end. That's what I believe is the case here. But be it as it may, the Ukrainian actions violated Russia's published nuclear doctrine in terms of a red line that would trigger a Russian nuclear response. Now, either this doctrine has meaning or it doesn't. I'm not encouraging Russia to use nuclear weapons, far from it. But the Russian retaliation has to be of a scope and scale, and that reestablishes the concept of deterrence, meaning that if you cross this red line, you will pay a price that is disproportional. In such a price that you will never want to even consider doing that again. And I believe that has yet to come. What we're seeing here is a campaign that may unfold over the course of a week or more. And it will culminate in what I believe will be a strategic strike, not of a nuclear nature, but a strategic strike on Ukraine that sends a message, not just to the Ukrainians by inflicting excruciating harm on them, but to the West as well, that this will be the and this will be the price that is paid in the future to your cities. Rybkov, the deputy foreign minister of Russia, recently talked about that Russia is about ready to unveil a new generation of weapons. He talked about the expiration of the INF Treaty, America withdrawing from the INF Treaty, but Russia had a moratorium on the deployment of these weapons. But because of the provocations of the West, Russia will be responding, and I believe that response will be in the form of not just Oreshnik, but I believe there's probably going to be at least one and maybe a couple more new generation intermediate range weapons. If you look back on old Soviet doctrine, and the Russians seem to be drawing upon that in the ballistic missile field in terms of their developments, projects that were underway during the Soviet Union were brought to an end because of arms control, or the end of the Soviet Union, mothballed because Russia couldn't afford it, have now been brought back to life. The Oreshnik is one such system. I believe that you'll see a follow-on system similar to a missile developed by the Russians called the Skorost back in the 1980s. The Skorost was a direct response to the Pershing II deployment into West Germany. And the purpose of the Skorost missile was, if the Pershing II left its base and went to the field in an operational manner, the Skorost job was to rapidly respond and put a missile on that target instantly. And I think you're going to see the Russians fielding something, because we're talking about the potential deployment of the Dark Eagle hypersonic intermediate range system into Europe next year. Russia's going to preempt of that, and we may get an operational demonstration on Ukraine. But either way, I don't think we've seen the response to the attack on the nuclear infrastructure, because that response has to reset the notion of deterrence, and Russia hasn't done that yet.
Yeah. Colonel Wilkerson, would you agree with Scott's assessment, and what's your particular take on the situation?
Yes, I do. And I would add to it that in 2013 and 2014, when we were hearing from the Finns and from others who were observing Russian maneuvers inside Russia through the Center for Naval Analyses and other conduits, we heard the argument and bought the argument ourselves that precision-guided munitions had reached the stage whereby, in this case, Russia truly feared them at that time, because they, in combination, gave the equivalent of a nuclear attack. And Russia at that time felt NATO had an extraordinary advantage in terms of numbers of precision-guided munitions. These are conventional munitions, not nuclear. So I think that's a fair argument. And what Scott has just said is, it's not only a fair argument, their PGM stockpile has increased majorly and gained some even new weight from technological advances and so forth. So they could make the equivalent of a small yield nuclear strike with PGMs. That's my point. My bigger point, that tactical operational point, I agree with Scott on that. My bigger point is that I think we should see now, and Donald Trump, I hope, through the opaque lens he glances at the world through on occasion, needs to see that he is absolutely indispensable to bringing this to a close. And I don't mean because he's head of the empire, but I mean because he's probably the only person, and maybe head of the empire gives him this power, to effect a higher level, if you will, end of the present relationship and beginning of a new relationship. And what I mean there is simply the relationship between Washington and Moscow, which outweighs all of this tactical operational business, no matter how much we may lament the casualties it's creating and how stupid it makes the empire look. And what Trump needs to deal with, over the head of Zelensky if necessary, over the head of his European allies if necessary, is this new relationship with Moscow. And if he has to walk with track shoes over Zelensky's head, and even over Macron and Starmer and Mertz's head, so be it. This needs to take precedence, and it needs to overshadow, if you will, everything else. We need a new relationship with Moscow and Washington, if for no other reason than the existential one of nuclear weapons are getting out of control.
Yeah, Garla, let me bring you in here. Talk about your reaction to the U.S.'s response to all of this, because this conflict is it's seemingly far from over in terms of the at least stated promise by Donald Trump to end this conflict as soon as possible, even within 24 hours. But let's just say as soon as possible after he became president.
You know, one of the things I think that we can pick up from the clip that you just showed was that the U.S. Strategies never work against Russia because we don't understand Russia, because we create some boogeyman that this is just a dictatorship and everything is top down, that the leadership of Russia really is only one single dictator that does not respond to the people. And if you'll notice what the person who was being interviewed said, he talked about public outcry. He talked about, he seemed to imply that the government of Russia was kind of pushed into a corner. Not saying that they didn't want to respond, but they had to respond because of public outcry. Now, the strategies of the neocons are always based on an assumption that Putin runs everything, and then he's going to be emotional. Putin's angry, Putin's scared, Putin's upset. The emotions of a single individual, as opposed to a government that has to respond to the public. In fact, one of the things that you can see going on during this conflict, I think that implies that, is that the government has taken had a great concern about their economy, about ensuring that the people in Russia are not suffering economically, that their stores are not empty, etc., so that they don't get pushback from people suffering. So what I picked up from this particular clip, I think, was that as long as we assume that this is a dictatorship that does not respond to the public, our plans and strategies will go awry. I think that the one thing I'll add is this, that I think that what we're seeing here is also a change in tactics. I think that a lot of these strikes in Kiev, may be wrong, this is just my opinion, I think that the Ukrainians hid a lot of things, or put a lot of their strategic assets in urban areas and highly populated areas, taking advantage of the fact that the Russians were much less likely to hit targets that were in a highly populated area. I think all the strikes in Kiev shows that one of the things that they're doing is they're saying, okay, we're going to take the gloves off, and if you hide it in a highly populated area, we're going to hit it anyway and let the chips fall where they may. So that's just a couple of things that I thought.
Yeah, Scott, you made a great point earlier about how this is all a reaction, especially to the the passenger train attacks, which actually Mr. Bedinsky mentioned later in the interview. So some have surmised that this war, this conflict, or shall we say special military operation, as Russia calls it, is moving into a counter-terror operation. Do you agree with that? And what would be the implications?
There's political aspects to that and military aspects to that. Politically, I think it's already a counter-terrorist operation, because the Russian government has labeled Zelensky and the Zelensky government as a terrorist organization, a terrorist entity, as terrorists themselves. When you have Vladimir Putin making that comment, that is declaratory policy. And I think the political implications of that are quite clear, and we've seen them manifested in the Russian presentation in Istanbul, where the Russians have laid out in their conditions for conflict termination a new election that replaces the president, replaces the parliament with something that manifests the will of the Ukrainian people. And only with this newly elected entity can Russia finally conclude peace. And that is a reflection of the fact that Russia views the Ukrainian government as it currently exists as a terrorist entity. So I think politically that decision has been made. Militarily, no, I don't think Russia is going to transition from a special military operation that has very specific goals and objectives to a counter-terrorist operation, which is a completely different ball game from a military standpoint. The objectives would be different, etc. Russia's in the business right now of demilitarizing Ukraine. That's not a counter-terrorist operation objective. This is standard. You were going to kick your ass 3 ways from Sunday. And that's what Russia's doing. They are demilitarizing the old school way. That's closing with and destroying the enemy through firepower maneuver, shoving a bayonet, except they don't do bayonets anymore, putting a drone up their ass and blowing them up. And Russia is dominating the battlefield in ways that are beyond the imagination and comprehension of people here in the United States. And Russia's not going to do anything to change that. Denazification is a political objective, but denazification is just another fancy way of talking about anti-terrorism. Because how do you deal with the Nazis? The same we deal with the terrorists. You delegitimize them. You write them out of the Constitution. You take them out of the government. So that's already happening. But I don't see the Russian military suddenly waking up and declaring a global war on terror. I think the Russian military is doing what it's doing. What you may see down the future is that this will transition from a special military operation into a state of war. Especially if Ukraine is unwilling to make the political transitions that Russia is demanding. If the Ukrainian government continues to insist on existing in its current manifestation, then Russia will have to go to war against this government. It's also, when we speak of setting deterrence, I think, in Russia at some point in time, one of the ways to deter Western engagement is that I believe Europe and NATO and the European Union, even the United States, have exploited this unique thing called a special military operation, which is war, but not war. I mean, what war do you get to ride a train from the Polish border into Kiev willy-nilly all the time? No war that I've ever been aware of. If I were doing targeting, that train line would have been taken out on day one. But there are many examples of this, the inconsistencies of targeting, or I would say that just the different approaches that the West has exploited. I think we will see Russia transition to a war, and the targeting will be different, and their approach towards Western engagement will become different too. There are potential outcomes there that will be very serious, especially if Europe continues to indicate that it's going to continue to pour resources into Ukraine. That's something that Russia cannot allow to happen. Let's just be honest. Russia right now has the military capacity on hand in the theater to expand this conflict to the Dnieper River, maybe recapture Kherson, move into Mykolaiv, and stabilize Kharkov and Sumy, and recapture Donetsk. But Russia doesn't have the capacity right now to take Odessa. That would require additional hundreds of thousands of troops to be mobilized. Russia doesn't have the capacity to take all of Sumy, all of Chernihiv. It would require additional resources. And to get to those additional resources, Russia would have to enter into a new phase of the conflict, one which I believe would have to be manifested as a state of war. So I think we're going to have to get to that point. It doesn't mean that Russia is losing. It just means that a Russian victory now is going to have to be redefined as a total victory against Ukraine, not this special military operation.
Sorry about that, guys. Well, Colonel Wilkerson, and we can circle back to you, Scott, to finish this portion of the show off, because one of the questions I had as you were speaking, Scott, that Colonel Wilkerson and Garland pick up now, is that Scott mentioned that Russia is indeed kicking the behind of Ukraine on the battlefield. But I'm sure you've seen it. I'm sure you've gotten these comments. Many people are very skeptical about this. What do you say to those right now who are doubtful about Russia's capabilities to put this conflict to an end? Because when the bomber attack happened, I think there was a lot of enthusiasm on the part, especially of the pro-Ukrainian side, that this was somehow turning the table. So, Colonel Wilkerson, I'll put it to you, then Garland, then Scott, you can close it.
Going back to what Scott just said, I go back to my Clausewitz and talk about the dynamics of warfare and how warfare changes miraculously almost. It can transform itself in midstream, as it were, and be an entirely different war, an entirely different thing that was contemplated when the first bullet went down range. And I see the prospect for that here looming greatly. And I would just take a little bit of exception with what Scott said with regard to Odessa and perhaps further gains by Russia. Should we have, and I think there is the possibility for, a sudden and complete collapse of Ukraine. I'm talking about real chaos. I'm talking about people actually turning their backs and running. We used to call it in traditional combat the exploitation. That's where you kill more of the enemy than you ever did in the months preceding that maneuver. And you kill them because you're shooting and running forward, and they're shooting, if they are at all, and running backwards. So you're shooting them in the back. Now, that's just a description of a traditional battlefield where exploitation is being executed. But I think what we're seeing here is the possibility of that. The entire Ukrainian front, as it were, collapsing in almost a moment, and Russia in a moment of surprise suddenly realizing it has more opportunity than it thought it had in a conventional sense. And do they exploit that? And that's the term usually used with it. Do they exploit that, or do they just stop there and say, no, we've gained what we wanted to gain, maybe a little adjustment here, adjustment there, and we'll just hold what we've got? We are pregnant with that kind of possibility, I think, now, because the Ukrainians are losing so dramatically. And if you want to do away with these arguments that are being thrown out there by everyone from Lindsey Graham to Starmer to Mertz, that Ukraine is still on the qui vive, can still fight, can still hold on and everything quickly and dramatically, that would do it. That's a dangerous moment. It's a very dangerous moment. And one reason why I think, as I said before, we need to get some really serious effort going on here to stop this before we reach that point and give both sides a real dilemma. Ukraine a dilemma from the point of view, it's over, dude. It's over, and you have lost dramatically. And Russia, wow, we have won, and we've won in a way we never dreamed we would have won. And now how do we deal with it? How do we deal with it? We do not want all of Ukraine. Please, don't want all of Ukraine. But there it is. There it is.
Garland.
You know, I tend to think, I've thought for a while similar to what Colonel Wilkerson said, and that is that what Russia's doing is they're chipping away at the capabilities of Ukraine, and that when it falls, it all falls at one time. So they wouldn't have to, you know, certainly I agree with Scott, if they had to fight their way into Odessa and into these large cities of 1 million and 2 million people and take them individually, I mean, that is, you know, cost prohibitive as far as the amount of people that you would lose and equipment it would take, et cetera. But I think that if they continue to batter away at the capabilities of Ukraine, that either a political collapse or a military collapse, either one of them will have the same effect. I mean, if there is a political collapse, then certainly you've got people fighting on the front lines, looking over their shoulders saying, where are the orders coming from? Where's more stuff coming from? What do we do? What are we fighting for? So a political or a military collapse, I think, would give you the same outcome, which would mean a city such as Odessa, et cetera, will then becomes virtually undefended because you don't have a real military there saying we're going to be resupplied, we're going to have more people. They're just sitting there saying, what are we doing? We're calling headquarters and nobody's answering the phone. And I think that's where we get to. I think at that point you have two things. You have, number one, Russia has to decide, what do we want to do? How far do we want to go? And what do we want to take on our balance sheets? You know, how much of this do we want to have to feed people and fix? And that's one thing. I think the other thing is a crisis point for NATO, because people are going to be screaming at Trump, you got to do something. The Russians are breaking through. But the question is going to be, and what are our options? We don't have 500,000 people to throw at the road. We don't have the resources to go in there if we wanted to go to the Russian border and probably still get bashed to hell if we did it. So there will be a crisis point, I think. And I think that's kind of what we're kind of hovering around, is that crisis point, recognizing that the weight of the Russian army leaning on the Ukrainians and NATO's capabilities are going to come to a head at some point. And when they do, then where are we?
Yeah, Scott, round out this question and then we'll move on.
Round out this. First of all, I have just to point out, anytime I enter a conversation where somebody uses the term qui vive, I quit, because it's a level of intellect and you know. That's an Army term. I mean, Marine Corps was like quivy. It means who lives. It's a great term. I've just been chuckling ever since the colonel used it, because Thank you, sir, for injecting that kind of intellectual capacity.
General order number one.
Yeah, who lives? Who goes there? But look, I agree on the concept of collapse. Here's my thing with the Russians. The Russians have not shown a tendency to engage in the kind of classic big arrow exploitation warfare. And two, we have the British who are very heavily advising the Ukrainian forces right now on how to extend this conflict. And I think what we're going to get very soon is a point where the Ukrainians are going to withdraw to the Dnieper River line. And if they can withdraw to the Dnieper River line in a modicum of order, they could create a physical barrier that would be very difficult for the Russians to exploit rapidly. And then if they can settle behind that, anchored on Odessa in the south, Kiev in the north, and maybe Dnipropetrovsk in the center, that's where Russia would need more troops if they were going to do that. The other thing is, I think the Russians are concerned about a rapid exploitation to manage the collapse is another thing that the Russians are concerned about. And this is why the Russians are putting such an emphasis on trying to achieve a modicum of political stability in Ukraine, because one of the great problems that will be presented to the Russians is, war is an extension of politics by other means. Had to do that to you, Colonel Clausewitz.
With an admixture of violence.
I love the violent part, but my academic advisors would always tell me never forget that life isn't only lived in the trenches. But this is a conflict that's being waged economically against Ukraine, and very effectively so. We just saw that Ukraine defaulted on its payments. Ukraine is literally bankrupt as we speak. It's being fought socially. We'll go back to the economy. From an industrial standpoint, in power generation standpoint, Ukraine's economic infrastructure is likewise collapsing right now. And with the collapse of the economy comes the collapse of social sustainment. You'll see societal collapse where the people collectively lose faith in the government, which brings about political collapse. And ideally, if you're trying to collapse a society, you're putting pressure on all four fronts. But if you get the total collapse, it creates a vacuum, and that creates uncertainty. And the one thing that, speaking to Russian generals and Russian politicians, not politicians so much, but diplomats, about this, the Russians want predictability. The big term that the Russians always use is we prefer predictability. It helps us as we put forward plans. And when you have collapse in a vacuum, the chaos is the most unpredictable thing out there. And so I don't think the Russians are in the chaos generation mode. I think the Russians are in the controlled collapse mode, meaning that you want to create pressures that will compel the Ukrainians to be more acceptable of outcomes that are desired by the Russians. But when you have the collapse, you create potential that is unpredictable and could be detrimental. And so I don't know if the Russians want to go into the exploitation phase, because that brings with it the potential of political collapse. And what happens if you have political collapse and you're not ready to? What happens if the political collapse creates uncertainty in Western Ukraine, and suddenly Kiev collapses and Lvov says, we're the new Western Ukrainian, a new entity. We're creating our own Western Ukrainian state. The Poles and the Ukrainians have discussed this. Zelensky has spoken with the Polish president in the past about creating a potential Western Ukrainian state that is joined up with the Poles politically and economically. So if you have a collapse in Kiev and you don't have anything to replace it to assume control over the totality of Ukraine, you now have a Western Ukrainian entity where Polish troops now come in and declare this to be similar to what Russia did with with the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic, where suddenly these entities, these separatist entities, declared independence. Russia recognized the independence and then created a collective security arrangement with them. Poland could easily do that in the Western Ukraine. They could do it unilaterally, and they would have every right to do it if you have collapse, because Poland has to look out for its own national security interests. So it needs to bring stability to its eastern frontiers. Russia doesn't want that to happen. It doesn't want the same thing to happen in other parts of Ukraine. So I think Russia is looking for more of a soft landing, as opposed to a hard crash, which means this has to be managed very carefully, which is why we come back to the special military operation. One of the reasons why this is a special military operation is there's a heavy political component to this conflict to avoid what we normally want in a war. I mean, Colonel Wilkerson, you remember in the Gulf War, when Operation Desert Storm started, I remember when I opened up the op order, they broke it out of its sealed package and boom, opened it up. Very first thing that identified the goal and objective was, of course, the liberation of Kuwait. But to achieve this, we were to destroy the Republican Guard, which was the center of gravity for the sustained survival of the Saddam government. So we were going to bring down the Saddam government. That was written right there in the op order for Operation Desert Storm. And my God, we tried to do that. We got to the point where we had the Republican Guard surrounded, and we could have killed him. Give us 36 to 48 more hours, and there would have been 30,000 more dead Iraqi guardsmen, and the Saddam government would have collapsed. But then suddenly people woke up to, well, wait a minute. If Saddam collapses, we got 1.5 million Iranians mobilized on the border. What happens if they start making a move in? What happens if Kurdistan goes, I should say going south, even though it's in the north, but if Kurdistan goes wild and the Iranians move in there, what happens if suddenly we have the Iranians make a power move into the chaos here? Are we prepared to do that? And the answer was no. Even though we had all these troops there, we had not prepared for the potential of a sustained follow-on conflict with the Iranians. And so that's why we stopped killing Republican Guardsmen and started creating the conditions for the stability and survivability of the Saddam regime, the exact opposite of what we planned for at the beginning of this conflict. I think the Russians are smarter than this. The Russians understand that they have to manage this conflict to avoid total collapse, because the vacuum that's created is unpredictable. And I just come back to the Russians love predictability.
And I would just come back to the fact that Clausewitz's greatest enemy, defined as the friction of war, is
Once again,
you just described a great example of with your alternative government scenario, a great example of what could happen. Actually could happen. And there are other scenarios you could describe too that would involve Poland. Dastardly deeds.
Well, I think this is a good time to talk about the narrative war as well with regard to this conflict, because this is the talk that's coming out of a lot of the Western mainstream media. Putin is unleashing a summer offensive to break Ukraine. His killing machine has been told to deliver a glorious victory at any cost. And here's a direct quote from that. Maybe we can get the military folks in first on this before you, Garland. It says, quote, "The Ukrainian intelligence believe that Konstantinivka," I probably said that really wrong, "and neighboring Pokrovsk will be the center of Russia's summer campaign. There are concerns about northeastern province of Sumy too, where Russia has massed 50,000 troops and is advancing towards the provincial capital in a mirror of Ukraine's own cross-border operation last year." So Scott or Colonel Wilkerson, maybe we can get into the details of what actually is happening on the front line, because I think this is a big part of what's influencing the narrative war about that we are hearing bandied about in the Western mainstream media right now.
I'll let Scott answer that substantially in the beginning, at least. But I got to say this. That's one reason I never read The Economist anymore. What a pile of crap.
Well, I mean, glorious victory. It's not just a victory. It's a glorious victory.
A shill for the British government.
But they had to start off with those 3 words. The Ukrainian intelligence believe. Gee, I wonder where they got that from.
Yeah.
MI6 wrote it for Ukrainian intelligence.
Yeah.
You know, people always made fun of me when I said I was a Marine intelligence officer. They went, "Well, that's sort of, you know, inherently contradictory terms there." But you know, when you put Ukrainian intelligence out there, it's like I have a damn PhD. You know, so no offense. I'm being mean now. It's very unprofessional of me. I'm trying to be professional because Colonel Wilkerson is here and he set a high bar with qui vive. So look, I mean, in a way, The Economist isn't wrong when they describe the Russian killing machine. It is a killing machine. It's been finely tuned based upon the reality of the battlefield. Russia has brought this war under control, Russian control. And just imagine how difficult that is, you know, because Russia's fought several iterations of this conflict. Its initial engagement had a big political component to drive Ukraine to the negotiating table. That's a completely different kind of warfare. And it succeeded. They got Ukraine to the negotiating table within 6 days of initiating the special military operation. And within a month, they had successfully negotiated an agreement to terminate this conflict on terms favorable to Russia, but also favorable to Ukraine. It was I mean, if you compare and contrast the options Ukraine is facing today in Istanbul with the options they had back in 2022, man, they'd die to have those 2022 options available to them, but they missed that opportunity. But when Ukraine walked away, again, under pressure from the West, Russia transitioned to a second phase, which was basically to take control of Donetsk and Lugansk. To do this, they had to have the land bridge through Kherson and Zaporizhia, but Russia wasn't saying we're going to keep that. What Russia is saying is we're going to sustain this as part of our military campaign to achieve the liberation of Donetsk. And then afterwards, when we retrograde, when we have stable, we will pull back and this Ukrainian territory will be part of Ukraine. The proof in that is that Russia, in their negotiations with Ukraine, said we have no intention of holding on to this land. And as a good faith measure, they began to withdraw. They actively withdrew from around Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy. They were in the process of withdrawing in Kharkov. 50% of the Russian forces have been pulled back from the front lines in Kharkov as they were preparing to make a withdrawal back to the Lugansk borders. And that was exploited by Ukraine in the West with a $48 billion injection of military aid and assistance, the rebuilding of a Ukrainian military with Western training, and they carried out an offensive. But one of the reasons why the Ukrainians had great success at it is because the Russians weren't there. 50% of the troops were gone. They weren't prepared to fight a defense. They had to do a mobile withdrawal back to the lines that they were planning on falling back on. And then they brought in a new general, mobilized 300,000. They go into a different mode of fighting. And this mode was to transition to where the Russians can be dictating the outcome. Putin didn't want to have massive casualties. If you take a look at the Battle of Bakhmut, that wasn't the Ministry of Defense. That was a Wagner-driven operation, an anomaly in Russian military thinking, and it resulted in horrific casualties for the Russians in their victory. But that's not the Ministry of Defense's mode of fighting. They want to have a situation where they have more control over the tactical battlefield, where they are imposing their will. They're inflicting heavier casualties on the Ukrainians than they are receiving. But in order to get to that point, they had to absorb the attack of the Ukrainian army rebuilt by NATO. That was the summer 2023 counteroffensive, which Russia dealt with magnificently. But now Russia transitions over to its state where it is today. This requires getting the Ukrainians whittled down to limit their options. You can't allow Ukraine the opportunity to rebuild these massive reserves and pour them in as they want, because that creates an ebb and flow. For the Russians to win, they need to be in control consistently moving in. And so you do this by shaping the battlefield reality so that the Russian tactics, the Russian weapons, the Russian operational procedures produce a predictable outcome every time they apply it. And so the Russians have come up with about a way of fighting war. Their infantry tactics have been totally redone. I spoke to Abdi Aladanov, who is a Chechen lieutenant general. He's in the Russian military. So he's a Russian general, but he's of Chechen origin, a noted combat officer. Because as a Marine, I think in terms of, fire team rushes, squads operating support platoons, operating company operation, battalion, etc. The Russians have basically broken this war down in what we call 3s and 6s. And 3s is the size of your initial assault team. It goes in, it seizes a very defined piece of terrain, and then it's reinforced by the 6s, and they dig in until they stabilize, and they do it again. 3s and 6s. You don't want to go more than 3 in the assault team because of drone warfare. You present a target, the drones hit, boom. But they go into 3s because now they can support it with fire support, drone support, overlay drone support, and they can evacuate wounded if necessary. It's a very contained kind of warfare. Notice when I'm saying 3s and 6s, I'm not talking about big arrows punching through lines and maneuvering. I'm talking about very controlled, bite-sized operations taking place simultaneously across the battlefield. 3s and 6s all over the place. The Ukrainians responded to 3s and 6s by, again, this was a British concept, to throw drone swarms in. And drone swarms replaced the lack of artillery firepower. So the Ukrainians would hit them with drones. And you saw this in Pokrovsk and in other areas. When the Russians hit the drone storm, it came to an end. The Russian offense stopped cold. Now, what the Russians did is just simply divert over and outflank and eventually cause them withdraw. But what the Russians have come up with now, and you've heard this in talks with, for instance, the Azov Brigade, which is now the 3rd Assault Brigade, which is part of a larger corps of neo-Nazi Banderist loyalists. But these are very capable troops, very ferociously loyal to the regime. And they are complaining because they said, we used to be able to stop them with drones. But what the Russians have done now is that they are targeting our drone operators. They come in, and the second we start moving drones in, they hit us. They're killing. The most dangerous job in Ukraine today is a drone operator. You get killed the moment you go up. They say our drone operators have to withdraw. We lose the drone coverage. The Russians come in, and they push us back, and there's nothing we can do to stop them. Nothing. That's where we are on the battlefield right now, where Russia is dictating total control of the pace of operations. Is going to be slow, methodical. The kill ratios now in certain areas are 20-1, 20 Ukrainians to 1 Russian. And this is in a situation where the 3s and 6s are taking on a defensive position held by 11 to 15 Ukrainians. So you're sitting there going, well, wait a minute, in classic terminology, if I'm attacking 15 Ukrainians, I need a minimum of 45 of my guys, 3-1, maneuver and all that. That's not how it works, because the Russians dominate it, come in with the drones, suppress, and then they come in a carefully directed assault, and they kill all these people or capture them. And it's repeated over and over and over and over again. That's the reality of this battlefield. And this is not understood by all the idiots that are out there, singing I'm never going to denigrate the courage of the Ukrainian soldier. You know who else doesn't denigrate the courage of the Ukrainian soldier? The Russian soldier. The Russian soldiers say again, talking to Opti, who's no slouch when it comes to fighting. He's a lieutenant general. The man still, when he had some of his soldiers get wounded and the evacuation couldn't go get them, he left his command post, got in a BMP, and personally led the evacuation. Arrived there, he's laying down suppressive fire. His guy with him gets hit. He dresses that wound, evacuates that man, gets his guy out there. This is, at that time, he was a major general, doing a sergeant's job, just because that's how Russian officers are. They lead from the front. They're very brave. They often die. Hopefully Opti won't die, and he continues to do what he does. But, when you talk to Opti, and you get a feel for that the Russians are dominating this war intellectually, militarily. They design tactics based upon the reality, and their ability to adapt is amazing. As something happens on the battlefield, they take it back to the rear area, refine it. They take an officer off to the General Staff Academy who sits there, and they bring together, Colonel, you saw this at SAM, School of Advanced Military Studies, where they bring the majors, lieutenant colonels together, and they brainstorm. But the SAMs, it could take 6 months, a year and a half or something to come out of SAMs. The Russians, they go up there, Within a couple of weeks, they got it back down there, modified, sent to the front line, retrained the guys, and go. The ability of the Russian army to adapt to the realities of this is unreal, and it's something the West just doesn't. We don't understand what's happening on the battlefield right now. We don't understand it at all. We don't understand the extent to which drones are dominating this war, and we don't understand how fire support has changed, how infantry tactics have changed, how air support has changed. And I'll just leave with this. Another thing that people aren't picking up on, if I ever do write a book about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, I think I'm going to focus on the suppression of air defense, the Russian campaign to take out the integrated air defense of Ukraine, because it's been one of the most remarkable, underreported campaigns out there, because it's not a Ukrainian integrated air defense. It's a NATO integrated air defense. This is the best that NATO could do, and Russia cracked it like a rotten walnut. And I can guarantee you that if Russia could crack that, first of all, understand this, that the NATO air defense that was layered over into Ukraine is not doctrinal. Why? Because NATO never planned on having that concentration of air defense. They were never like, this much has to be put in there. They had to rewrite their doctrine to get air defense compressed like this. And the Russians beat them, whipped them, destroyed them.
Well, let me just throw something into that, because it's so pertinent. We're getting ready, Danny, to spend $2 to $3 trillion on legacy systems that experience utterly defies and refutes.
Yeah.
You're talking about Golden Dome.
Well, I'm talking about that, but I'm also talking about the bomber, the manned bomber. I'm talking about two manned fighters. It's absurd.
Yeah, and Colonel Wilkerson, definitely whatever else you want to add to what Scott laid out there, one thing also about cracking this air defense, these air defenses too. I mean, in one day alone, Kiev was hit with 315 drone strikes and 7 missile strikes on a random day in Kiev. And out of that, I think one civilian perhaps was killed. One, maybe. I mean, it was spread out across a few places. There were about 3 spread out across a few places. So wherever you want to react to what Scott said, as well as this development, because I think it does show not only just how much Russia has cracked these air defenses, but how precisely they've cracked them.
The only thing I would add to it, I can't add much to what Scott said. But I would add, in addition to how stupid we are in terms of the money we're going to spend, and even in Hegseth's new initiative to go out to Anduril and Palantir and others, it's the same stupidity, because they're looking at the same kind of legacy systems just with new technology, which is nuts. But the other thing I would say too is that what this probably means ultimately, as we were saying before at the ether level, is that we need to get this thing stopped, and we need to get it stopped through the President of the United States, no matter how incompetent he might be to that stoppage. We don't need any more of this. We're gonna let it get out of hand, and it reminds me too much of what we're doing in the Levant, in Gaza. What happened this morning with the conversation that supposedly happened between Trump and Netanyahu, where Netanyahu guaranteed him that he was willing to accept 3.67% enrichment by the Iranians, and that he wouldn't attack. This is all nonsense in my view. That's all propaganda from Netanyahu. I don't even know if it's a legitimate description of the phone call. But we're really waltzing around some very dangerous situations in the world right now. And we need to get at least one of them shut down, if not all of them shut down simultaneously. Otherwise, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. And at the same time, as I was trying to indicate with the money we're going to spend on these idiotic schemes, which just reward the military industrial contractors, we are bankrupt. We are bankrupt, and we just won't admit it to ourselves.
Garland, please come in here.
Well, one of the things I'll say about the air defense issue, and that is, I personally, I had my suspicions about the state of air defense, NATO state of air defense, and worldwide about the direction it was going. I recall some years ago at Fox, I was talking to some guy that was there to talk about, missile defense, and he was the head of like the U.S. Physicists Society or something, and he made it very simple. He just said, Garland, it's very, very simple. We just throw up so many missiles that you can't shoot them down. We just put a bunch of dummies. I fire. I don't care what you got for some Golden Dome. Back then it was missile defense. If I fire 1,000 missiles, 2,000, 3,000, 80% of them are dummies. You're not going to be able to stop it. That's the bottom line. Well, what we saw where I think the world learned a lot was the Iranian missile attack wasn't really an attack, a demonstration, shall we say, on Israel, where they just threw so many missiles and dummies and drones and all that stuff up that they overwhelmed an air defense. And that's where we are. And I think the U.S. isn't acknowledging that reality. As we say, you better do this, Iran, or else. Well, the reality is there is no or else, because if we say we're going to attack Iran, we have no guarantee that their air defense system, which is fairly elaborate, and it seems to have been beefed up by the Russians, may very well be able to repel an attack that we undertake against them anyway. Secondly, if they want to hit us, all they got to do is overwhelm all of our systems all throughout the region, and they can easily be defeated. So we're still pretending that we have this air superiority, pretending that we can attack Iran, pretending that we can stand up in the Pacific region, that we can actually fight China on their borders when we can't, when we've just been shamed by Yemen. So our government is living in this false military paradigm where we still have the capability to launch attacks against even, I wouldn't call them peer opponents, but fairly strong opponents, even weak opponents. We can't attack anybody. We don't need to get in a fight with anyone. And the only thing we're going to do is if we start punching against someone out here who has drones and missiles, is get ourselves humiliated once and for all. And hopefully it doesn't go really, really bad, because of course, our leaders are probably to some extent nuclear prone. And as soon as we punch somebody and they smack the daylights out of us, they're going to start screaming, let's send nukes. And that then, regardless of what happens, that ends the U.S. empire. That ends the U.S. as the project that it once was. So it's a very dangerous situation, but there is a reality that our leaders will not accept when it comes to how air defense has changed the military paradigm worldwide.
Yeah, indeed. And well, Scott, no, Colonel Wilkerson, please.
I was just going to say that's my greatest fear, is that we're going to get into something conventional. We're going to lose so badly. Think 3 carriers on the bottom of the ocean that we're going to go nuclear.
Well, Scott, I think this is a good time then to talk about this U.S.-Russia Citizen Summit that you are helping organize. I can pull it up. The link is in the video description if you want to talk about this, because I know a big part of your efforts to build a U.S.-Russia understanding is to prevent this exact scenario.
Yeah. First of all, I have to say this is, as Colonel Wilkerson knows, you don't win struggles through battles. You have to have a campaign. The campaign has to be linked to strategic objectives. And we've outlined some pretty difficult problems here. To me, one of the greatest problems that we face when it comes to U.S.-Russian relations is the expiration of New START Treaty in February. The lunacy of Golden Dome and the instability that those two things will bring together. But how do you get to that as a citizen? Because otherwise we just allow ourselves to be taken hostage by policymakers who don't give a damn what we think, and oftentimes formulate policy in a vacuum of politically driven stupidity, such as Golden Dome. I mean, it won't work, it can't work, but we're going to spend billions proving that point. But how do you get the citizens engaged? Because it's important that the citizens engage. I do believe when we speak of American democracy in the bottom-up approach, meaning that we, the people, have a voice and we can make this voice resonate, and that voice can achieve change if it's focused properly. Right now in the United States, the average American is infected. They didn't mean to be, but they have been infected just because of the way our society is structured with Russophobia. I mean, just think about it for a second. All the Hollywood movies that you watch, how are the Russians presented? As intelligent, wonderful people, cultured, or, you know, some guy with a fur hat and, you know, beer. I am a Russian. I drink vodka. I wrestle bears. I am very, very bad man. And, you know, we view them as dangerous. And the Russian women, of course, have wonderful accents, very beautiful, but they're trying to, you know, to put a knife in our back. This is how we've been conditioned, so that we fear Russia. We have an inherent fear for Russia. And from that fear, our government exploits us, and they put out policies that address this fear. That fear is derived from ignorance. I have found that one of the best tools for overcoming ignorance is direct dialogue. If I have a problem with my neighbor, rather than me sitting here going on social media and posting that problem and him responding or her responding, hypothetically, I don't do this, but I'm just saying, the best way to overcome that problem is to go have a conversation face to face. Hey, this is me. This is you. How you doing? Let's have a beer. Let's have a Diet Coke. Let's talk this thing out. We learn about each other, and misconceptions, misperceptions we had disappears. We realize we have a lot more in common than we have not in common. I think that's what we need to do with the Russian people. In 1985, Phil Donahue, the great Phil Donahue, great and late Phil Donahue, together with a man named Vladimir Posner, put together something they called the Space Bridge. They called it Space Bridge because the connectivity was through satellite telephones, a new technology back then. And it was a citizen summit, a Russian-U.S. citizen summit. And it allowed American citizens sitting in Seattle, Washington, to communicate with Russian civilians sitting in St. Petersburg. And they asked each other questions. They had a dialogue, and they began to realize that they're the same people. They're human beings, that they care about the same things. They laugh at the same jokes. They cry at the same, emotional triggers. They care. They want to live. And this initial space bridge then triggered others that helped create the environment that led to the lowering of the Iron Curtain and the normalizing of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then later Russia. Now, our politicians fumbled this opportunity, and today we're faced with a new Cold War looming. And do we trust the dialogue that's taking place between our government and the Russians? And I say no. The American people, our job isn't to trust the government at all. Our job is to hold the government accountable for what it does in our name. I think we need to set an example. And through the setting of this example, we need to also educate the American people not to be afraid of the Russians. And how do you do that? By exposing them to the reality of Russia. And so we're going to do, on the 40th anniversary of the original Space Bridge, we're going to do a Space Bridge, a new U.S.-Russian Citizens Summit. We're going to link 50 Americans with 50 Russians, and we're going to have a dialogue over the course of 3 hours. And it's going to be streamed live, and it's going to be recorded and available. And we hope to use that as a teaching mechanism for other Americans to say, hey, we want to engage with these Russians. They maybe repeat this exercise over and over again. And in the process, inoculate ourselves against Russophobia so that we're not afraid of the Russians. So when the government comes down and says, you must approve $175 billion to defend against the Russian threat, we go, well, wait a minute. Is there really a Russian threat? What if we just talk to them? It's cheaper and it produces better outcomes. And so that's what we're trying to do here. Some people might call me naive, and you know what? It may be naive. But I also view it as the beginning of a process, a campaign that will, because if I can get the American people to accept the premise that we can live in peace with the Russians, then I could get them to accept the premise that we don't need Star Wars. We don't need Golden Dome. We don't need new missiles, that we need to engage in arms control related dialogue. When was the last time you heard anybody talk about arms control in the Trump administration anywhere? It's just not part of the national lexicon. It used to be everything. Back when I was a young buck, that's what I cut my teeth on. I didn't mean to. I joined the Marine Corps to close with and destroy, but next thing I know, they got me in the middle of the Soviet Union, engaged in arms control verification. And I fell in love with it because it was good. It brought about a nice result. It's made the world a safer place. And I became a believer in these arms control treaty vehicles. We're out to watch the last remaining one expire, and there's nothing to replace it. The treaty that I implemented that I believe saved the world from destruction, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, is no more. And the weapon systems that we once got rid of are now threatening to come back and bring the world close to, the kind of danger that prompted us to get rid of them to begin with. But the campaign can only be waged if you have a solid foundation upon which to build the campaign. And I believe that we need a foundation of support from the American people that's predicated on a willingness to engage with the Russians responsibly, people to people. And that's what this Citizen Summit is all about. It'll be on June 18th in Kingston, New York. It's a ticketed event because we don't have the budgets. We tried to go to New York City and look at getting a theater that could hold a couple hundred people. And I think the low end budget was $120,000. And I went, yeah, that's like orders of magnitude above my budget right now. So we downsized, but it doesn't mean it's a lack of quality. The event is held at Gerald Celante's wonderful Mohican Market. We've converted it into what we call the American Cafe. So when the Russians look in, they're going to see a slice of Americana. This isn't going to be Hollywood. Thank God. I think LA's under fire right now. It's not going to be New York City, too expensive. It's going to be America, and we're going to be staffing it with Americans, the average working class Americans from all walks of life. And that's what the Russians are going to see, the good, the bad, whatever. It's going to be the real America. And I hope we get to see the real Russia, and we get to, drop all pretense. This is who we are. This is what we're about. And have a meaningful dialogue. It's a wonderful opportunity. And thankfully, Garland, you've spoken about this in the past, and Danny, we've talked about it, and Larry, we've done the same thing. I apologize, sir, Colonel Wilkerson. God, who am I to call Colonel Wilkerson? No, I know. I let my guard down. my former mentors looking up at him, going, God, I can't say what he's going to say, but Ritter, don't you ever get familiar with a colonel again. But it's just in my training. But the point is, we're talking about the importance of alternative media. This isn't going to be covered by mainstream media. They would never touch this. In fact, the Russians initially tried. I mean, it's amazing. They reached out to all the mainstream media, and they either got a stead, no way are we going to do this, or just no response. And so they were concerned about this alternative media approach. But what I tried to tell them is that we have this family of podcast idea. I mean, last year we could do events that would end up getting 3 to 5 million views, and the potential for even more. That's outperforming much of the mainstream media alternatives out there. So even though this is a smaller venue, I think we're going to crack into the American audience. I think we're going to get a good audience. I think we have the chance of succeeding. And so I'm excited about this opportunity. And I have some friends that I communicate with who are very interested in this conflict, who are depressed right now, because how could you not be depressed after listening to some of the stuff that we were throwing out there earlier? This is a very dangerous situation. And there's so many people that listen to this harsh reality we put out there that just get overwhelmed with depression and say, it's just hopeless. It's hopeless. And so the Citizen Summit also injects, I think, a positive vibe to bring some hope that there is a potential pathway out of there. And I like to wake up in the morning and not just say I'm here to confront problems, but I'm here to solve problems. And I think the Citizen Summit is one part of a solution to the complex problems we face today. But thanks for allowing me to talk about it, Danny. I really appreciate it.
There you go, Danny.
Of course, I was muted. Everyone can find the link to the U.S. Citizen Summit in the video description below after the show. And you can also find Scott is now on YouTube again, so you can find his YouTube channel too.
Today was the first post. We'll see how long YouTube allows me to stay up. But I'll just can I make one last pitch?
Okay, sure.
As I said, the New York City venue is $120,000. We couldn't afford it. We initiated something based upon the budget that we had. I can already tell you that the actual expenses are going to be 2 or 3 times greater than the initial thing. Now, I'm not talking 6 digits, but I am talking, a couple $1,000s that we need to raise. We're not charging any money for people to come to this thing, but there's a donation button in this thing. And if people can see fit to donate, it would be greatly appreciated. It doesn't go into my pocket. What I can guarantee is that if I don't get the donations, it comes out of my pocket because I have personally committed to making this succeed. And if you want Scott Ritter to be married to Mrs. Ritter for a significant period of time, help me save my marriage, because I have committed myself to something that financially, anyways, if you believe in peace, you want to make this work, and you want to save my marriage, donate.
There you go. There you go. That's the pitch. Well, everyone, you can find that link again in the video description below. Gentlemen, I have one more story I want to cover on West Asia, what's been going on there. I know, Scott, you have another appointment in about 20 minutes. How about we do this story, and then, Scott, if you have to run out, you can run out. Does that sound good? All right.
Sounds good.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Well, I wanted to begin this story then. We can begin with you, Colonel Wilkerson, because of course there's been this report about Iran obtaining what they are saying are a trove of strategic and sensitive Israeli intelligence on perhaps the nuclear facility, their own nuclear facilities, maybe their own nuclear weapons depots. We don't know exactly, but they're saying it is very valuable information. And then you have Donald Trump. It seems like he's changing all the time his position on the nuclear negotiations in terms of his public presentation. Some days he's saying, well, we're going to allow enrichment. Now he's saying no enrichment at all for Iran, and that they're rejecting Iran's propositions. And then we have, of course, what happened with the Gaza Freedom Flotilla. Colonel Wilkerson, what's your reaction to all of this? Where are we in not only the U.S.-Iran situation, but a lot of this revolves around Israel. So talk about your reaction to these developments.
Let me take the last one you mentioned first. I was reading something, I think, I don't remember where it was, but it was Special Rapporteur Albanese, who's been very outspoken on this, unlike many UN people, consistently. And she essentially said, where was the Greek Navy? Where was the Turkish Navy? Where was the Italian Navy? Where was any Navy in the Mediterranean that's worth a damn? This is a violation of international law. Now, we know that previous ones were too. Conscience was hit by a drone and big hole blown in her. She had to go into Port Malta. And many attempts beforehand have either been stymied or met with Israeli force. This one they did on the high seas, not in their territorial waters, not by any stretch of imagination. And they did it in a more, shall we say, open way, because I think they realized, particularly with Greta Thunberg on board and others, that it would have been a dramatic, and this in the past does not seem to have dissuaded them, public relations fiasco if they did something and harmed someone. But I take Albanese for what she's saying. No one is prosecuting any action against the Israelis for violating international law on the high seas. And we do freedom of navigation exercises all the time in the South China Sea and elsewhere. And our ostensible purpose is to protect the high seas and to protect the regime that has grown up over the years in terms of the law of those seas. No one's doing anything here. I don't expect the United States to do anything, bastards that we are, but someone should be taking Israel on in a very forceful, dynamic way as they do these things that are so public and so seen by the world everywhere that are wrong. That's my first comment. My second comment is I don't think this administration knows what's up and what's down with regard to these negotiations with Iran. And I say that and then qualify it with the remark that I made earlier that this morning I heard there was a phone call between Netanyahu and Trump. Whether it's apocryphal or not, I don't know. I hope it's not. And Netanyahu, in whatever sincerity Netanyahu can muster, told Trump that he was willing to accept 3.67 or 3.76, whatever it is, the lowest percentage of enrichment, and not go to war. And he would make a promise to that effect to Trump. If that occurred, then that takes, I think, the red line that both the Ayatollah and the foreign minister Arshi has said are indeed red lines out of the negotiation impossibility, and opens up some vistas for making progress on this agreement that I think fundamentally Donald Trump would rather see. He'd rather have an agreement. Won't be much different from the JCPOA, but who cares? I mean, he screwed that one up himself. We'll have an agreement and we can proceed on those lines. And then what we do really, as Scott knows well, we are just working out the details of a verification regime, so to speak, and how the IAEA is going to do it. Now, a complication, the IAEA just announced that Iran has, and I didn't see the specifics, I'm waiting for them, but Iran has been caught cheating, or not cheating necessarily, but going beyond what the parameters were with the IAEA for what it could do in its nuclear program. So we got to see that too. But in any event, if we have got an opening now where we can go back to some reasonable negotiations and Witkoff cannot have handcuffs on himself, then I'm guardedly optimistic about working that one out. At the same time, I think Israel is in such straits right now. It's doing things like bringing in what I would call mercenary terrorists, if you will, to fight Hamas on the ground in Gaza. It's got this humanitarian organization going that, for all intents and purposes, looks to me like a U.S., British-funded, Israeli-funded organization to gather Palestinians so they can be more efficiently killed, despite its remonstrances to the contrary. I think that is what it was designed for, to get more Palestinians killed faster, to make the death march more efficient. And I think Israel's in trouble. I really think it's in trouble. I've been saying that for some time, but I've been, I think, accurate in my assessment. I haven't even mentioned some of the other problems that they have, but now they've even got the Lebanese government, tool of the United States that it is, saying things about their presence in Lebanon. They are expanding their presence in Syria. At the same time that the new leader of Syria is walking through the park in central Damascus with his wife and looking anything but like an Islamic chieftain and extolling the virtues of democracy and the new relationship he has with the United States and such. And God knows what that's going to mean eventually, because we just inked an agreement to keep our troops there in perpetuity, as far as I can see. They're all around the zinc field, of course. And they're there ostensibly to fight ISIS, and intelligence sources telling me that there hasn't been an ISIS fighter around there in a long time, except in prison. So I don't know where this is going, but I don't think Israel is in good straits right now. I think it's in dire straits. And so where do we go with this? Do we make an agreement, and do we have an agreement that Netanyahu reluctantly accepts? Does his government fall? Looking a lot like that might happen too. And what replaces him if it does? This is a very difficult situation to assess right now, and I'm not confident, and this is my biggest problem, I'm not confident with this team. Their diplomatic prowess is limited to Witkoff. They have no national security decision-making process that I can detect. Things are happening underneath the president's responsibility, if you will, in the intelligence community. I would have already fired Gabbard if I were Donald Trump. I would have fired Ratcliffe too. I think a lot of these things that have happened that are causing him enormous problems are happening because the so-called deep state, and it is a deep state, and it is there, and it's mostly neoconservatives spread all over the government, is doing things with his own intelligence community. Lindsey Graham is right there in the middle of it too, as are probably some other members of Congress, that are not what he wants done. And his lack of attention, and lack of attention to detail in particular, is causing a wide avenue to open up for these things to happen. That's a long answer to I'm not as optimistic as I was hoping I would be after hearing this information this morning.
Garland.
Well, I would like to hope that some kind of a deal initially happens, but the contradictions here are so extreme that it's hard for me to believe that these things will be ironed out. There are three particular ones. Number one, we are supposedly negotiating with Iran so that they don't get a nuclear weapon, but the U.S. intelligence assessment has repeatedly said that Iran is not trying to weaponize their nuclear program. So the United States kind of official position is the government, the executive branch, is negotiating to stop Iran from getting something that their own intelligence experts have said that Iran's not trying to get. So Iran simply says, you know what? Fair enough. That's a contradiction you have to deal with, but we're willing to make you a deal. How easy is it for us to make this deal? We don't want to do it anyway. I mean, we don't want these nuclear weapons anyway. But that's a strange contradiction that people don't even ask President Trump. Somewhere, somehow, at one of these press conferences, someone should bring that up, and nobody in the mainstream media will ever do that. The next thing is this: that Iran is acting within the scope of international law, even when it comes to their nuclear program. Israel clearly is not. So here's another contradiction. We're saying to Iran, you can't do things that international law allows you to do, while we all know that Israel is denying. Israel, one day they'll say, well, I think we should nuke Iran. I think we should nuke Gaza. We should nuke everybody. But we won't admit that we have nuclear weapons. That's a weird contradiction that you have to consider how that affects the overall narrative. And last but not least, I would say this, that if I'm Iran, based on the history of the U.S. keeping its word, be it the Minsk Accords, the JCPOA, even in the JCPOA, from the very beginning, the U.S. said, if you do this, we'll drop certain sanctions, and never did it. We never kept our word. If I'm Iran, I say, okay, we're going to write this deal, this contract, and every contract has something which executes the contract. And if I'm Iran, I'd say, we got the deal. Okay, the deal's all great. Okay, this contract that we have now is executed when you drop the sanctions. You said last time you said you were going to drop the sanctions, and you didn't, and you asked us to go along with it, even though you didn't keep up your end of the bargain. Iran has to say, whatever we write up is officially executed when you hold up your end of the bargain. That executes it. Because the truth is, the U.S. will promise to drop the sanctions, but they ain't dropping the sanctions. So if Iran makes that argument, if they get that in there, there's no deal anyway, because the U.S. is not going to keep their word. So this thing is so full of contradictions. I would like to believe that we could get a deal, but how do you mitigate contradictions of that magnitude?
Scott, definitely wherever you want to react to all of this. I also, given that you are former intelligence, marine intelligence, I would also like you to talk about, if you could, what exactly could Iran have now, and what would be the significance, but wherever you want to take it, before and after.
Look, we've got to be very honest about where we're at here. Yes, Iran says they don't have a nuclear weapons program. Iran has a nuclear weapons program. That's just the straight up truth. It's not your classic nuclear weapons program, meaning that it's been organized to, be this way. But there is no other reason for Iran to have 60% enriched uranium other than to be one step away from nuclear weapons potential. And the Iranians have admitted this. They said that they produce 60% enriched uranium to be a threshold state. Threshold to what? Threshold to what? So that's a threat. That's an implied threat. Now, we can sit here and talk about the inherent contradictions of Israel and all this kind of stuff. It doesn't matter. Iran's not allowed to have nuclear weapons. That's the law. Iran is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There is no clause in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that says, oh, just because Israel gets to do it, you get to violate that. The Iranian government has put the IAEA Director General on notice that if Israel strikes Iran, Iran will withdraw from the NPT and will build nuclear weapons. Now, how do you build nuclear weapons in short order if you don't have a nuclear weapons program already envisioned, in mind, ready to execute? You see, if you can enrich to 60% enriched uranium, you can enrich to 98%. This is one step. And the Iranians have advanced enriched enrichment cascades they've already put together. They've assembled. They're underground in Firdos, can't be struck by conventional weapons. Iran has all of the tools. All these missiles that we saw get fired against Israel, the new hypersonic missiles, etc. People haven't really thought too much about that technology that goes into it. Because one of the things that people say is, well, and we used to say this about the Iraqis. There's a big difference, because they said Iraq's going to have a breakout nuclear weapons program. And 6 months after stealing all the enriched uranium from their reactor and processing it and enriching it, they could produce a device. But that device weighed like 2,000 pounds. Couldn't be delivered by anything. And you had to, bring it out in the truck and do the experiment. To create a weapon, and we said this about the North Koreans too. Do the North Koreans truly have a nuclear capable ICBM? Because to fire an ICBM, it has to get high up, comes in, reentry, heat, what burns up electronics, and do the North Koreans have what it takes to survive reentry? Do they have electronics capable of surviving in the complex world of ballistic missile launch? Well, Iran proved that. See, Iran fired extraordinarily sophisticated warheads at Israel. These are maneuverable warheads, hypersonic warheads, warheads that absorb heat, advanced composite materials in the warheads, electronic packages, sophisticated electronic packages that are designed to survive the heat of reentry. So every single obstacle that exists to employ a nuclear warhead on a missile has been overcome by the Iranians technologically. They already have it. And the weapons design doesn't have to be the most sophisticated implosion device. If you want to deliver a weapon of 15 to 20 kilotons, a simple uranium gun device is all that's needed. And so Iran is literally weeks away from having a deliverable nuclear weapon. That's what a threshold state is, and Iran has positioned itself to be a nuclear threshold state. Does it have a right to? I guess all the component pieces fall into Article 4 of the Nuclear Nonproliferation. But let's not pretend that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapons program. Even Tulsi Gabbard's ridiculously worded statement, it just talks about the political decision to make a nuclear weapon and that it doesn't have a declared nuclear weapons capability. But everything I said is absolutely 100% true, verifiable, confirmed by multiple Iranian statements themselves. So that's where we're at today. This isn't a game. Okay. And I will also say this. The United States and Israel will never allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. So for all the people out there who fantasize about, let's level the playing field, let's get an Iranian nuclear bomb so it level. Do you know that the head of Central Command today is briefing the President of the United States on all military options to attack Iran's nuclear program right now? And when I say all military, remember that cascade I talked about that can take it to the next step to 98%? That's in Firdos, the underground nuclear reactor. That can't be hit by anything we have conventionally. And if we don't take it out in the first strike, Iran has a nuclear weapon. So what does that tell you? I'm a military planner. I've done this. It tells me that I apply the weapon to the problem. I've identified a problem. I've identified a level of destruction that's necessary, and I need a weapon capable of doing that. We have those weapons. They're nuclear weapons. And I'm telling you right now, there's a nuclear strike plan being planned against Iran as we speak. I've been warning about this from day one. I've been trying to tell the Iranians, don't become a threshold state because you're playing a game you can't win. You're playing a game you can't win. I'm not saying we're going to win. I don't say anybody wins. But Iran doesn't emerge from this intact. This will not just be a strike to take out Iran's nuclear capability. It will be a strike to take out Iran itself. It's being planned right now. Central Command just informed the President of the United States that those plans are being presented to the White House as we speak. Now, is this bluff? Is this posturing? It could be. It could be. But this is how dangerous the situation is, where we have boxed ourselves into a rhetorical corner with this zero enrichment nonsense. This could have been solved 2 weeks ago. I mean, Witkoff had a deal. The Iranians have bent over backwards to make this deal possible. They have bent over backwards. They have agreed to allow U.S. inspectors on the ground as part of the IAEA teams. I'm here to tell you, as a former U.S. inspector who operated on the ground in Iraq, with a U.S. inspector comes the U.S. intelligence community, which means that, in effect, Iran has said we're going to allow American spies to come on the ground and do the spying. Because why? They want to solve this problem. Iran has agreed to limit their enrichment to 3.75%. Iran has agreed to allow excess enrichment capacity to be classified as a fuel bank operating under American, UAE, Saudi joint partnership, Russian joint partnership. Iran has done everything necessary to make this deal possible. And Donald Trump, in his mouth, in his ego, in his ignorance, is putting us on the cusp today where the Central Command General is briefing him on nuclear strike options against Iran. That's where we're at right now. That's the seriousness of this. And I don't think the moron in, I apologize, I said I wasn't going to go down that path. Be responsible, Scott, be responsible. This man is going to kill us all. This man is going to get us involved in things, because I will tell you this right now. If we nuke Iran, which would be what we do, we don't take out their missile capability. And Iran will now kill 10,000 American service members who are in bases surrounded. They will take out the state of Israel. That creates instability in its own right. Remember how we talked earlier about Ukraine? You don't want to create a vacuum of chaos because you can't predict outcomes. It's the same problem we had when we took out Saddam Hussein. We were smart in 1991. Don't get rid of Saddam because we don't know what comes after. Keep the devil that you know so you can control predictability. But then we yanked him out. Chaos ensued. The next thing you know, the entire Middle East is aflame. This is an extraordinarily dangerous situation right now. And how many Americans are talking about it? And in order to engage Americans, the second I talk about this, they all say, oh, you're fear-mongering. Garland, you know, a month ago, Danny, you know, a month ago, I was telling you this was going to happen. And I'm not saying you, Danny, but your audience was like, fear-mongering. No, Ritter, this, that. Screw you people, because we're on the cusp of a nuclear war right now. The commanding general of CENTCOM is briefing the president of the United States as we speak on nuclear strike options against Iran. It's not Scott Ritter warmongering, guys. It's reality. It's here. It's now. And what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? We've left ourselves in this fantasy world where Israel's got nuclear weapons, therefore Iran should be allowed to have nuclear weapons. Well, that's going to get everybody killed. Iran is not allowed to have nuclear weapons. They're not going to have nuclear weapons. And if they position themselves to be a threshold state on the cusp of having them, they will be eliminated. And we have a general building the plans to do that right now as we speak. What are we going to do to stop this? How do we stop this? Well, the good news is, I think Israel woke up to the fact, because Iran has that intelligence. This is why you got the phone call from Netanyahu this morning, because Netanyahu woke up and went, what's happening? America's going to do what? Because we were just bullshitting about attacking Israel. We were never going to attack Israel. That was just posturing. You guys are getting ready to attack Israel? That means we die. That means I die. They got the location of my home and all my secret hiding places, and their missiles will come in. We don't want to die. Mr. President, we'll take 3.75% enriched uranium. Now, what is Donald Trump going to do with that? Donald Trump's prior position was zero, because that's what Netanyahu was telling them. None, zero, can't have it. If Netanyahu truly committed 3.75% enriched uranium, can this president back off? Can he accept that? This is where we're at. I mean, this is we keep talking about Ukraine, and it is a dangerous situation. Don't get me wrong. This situation with Iran is one of the most dangerous situations we face today, because American nuclear weapons could be used at any moment, And as Witkoff said, the moment one nuclear weapon's used, the entire global market collapses overnight. Whatever you think you have in terms of retirement funds, whatever you think's going on, all that stuff, it's gone. The whole world. That's where we're at right now. I don't mean to get too spun up, Danny, but I've been warning about this for a long time. And I feel like I'm speaking till I'm blue in the face, and I feel like the digital mob never got it. Who the hell is that guy? Danny Thang or whatever the hell his name is. You just sit there and pontificate stupidity. Well, all your stupid pontification out there, guys, how are you going to stop this, the commanding general of Central Command from briefing the President of the United States on nuclear strike plans? That's happening right now. You aren't. That's it. I don't mean to be too depressing, but there's where I'm at.
Well,
I got to run.
Colonel,
Unfortunately, I've got a guy on. So I'm going to sit there and throw that hornet's nest out there.
Before Scott leaves, let me just dampen it a little bit. I have been in the room with a 4-star Navy admiral when we had developed plans for nuclear strikes that were going to be briefed to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the President of the United States. That's not, I won't say it's common, but this won't be the first time if it's happening at Central Command. The president wants all options. And that sometimes, and in my experience, twice, it was an option I actually saw. I actually did some of the war planning on. So that's not necessarily an indication that we're going to do it. But I agree with Scott that it is an indication that it's there and being thought about. And that's dangerous. It's extremely dangerous. Japan is a threshold nuclear state, far more sophisticated than Iran, but Japan is our ally, and so we don't say anything about that. Japan could be a full-up nuclear power in 6 to 8 months with everything that we have, probably. The difference is that we see Iran as an enemy. For what reason, I have a hard time figuring out from time to time, but we see them as an enemy. If we were to do what Scott is saying there's the potential we do, and I agree that there might be the potential for it, it'd be a disaster. We would have opened the genie. We would have put it on the table, and we'd have been the first ones to do it, which I've been saying all along. Who did it in 1945? Who invented the technology, stealing the world's scientists and putting its own scientists in there with them? And who did it in 1945? Not once, but twice against human beings. We will do it again. So, leaven it a little bit, and then it's a serious.
I just want to add before I go, just to make things happier. I spoke with a senior Russian in the know, and he said that he said Russia won't be the first to use tactical nuclear weapons. Russia's not going to break the Hiroshima and Nagasaki psychological barrier. But if the United States uses tactical nuclear weapons, Russia won't. They say it will become commonplace, and that's the big danger. We're not talking about global ending this, but we are talking about now that nuclear weapons now have become a tool to solve smaller problems. And he said Russia will definitely use nuclear weapons if that's the case. So America breaking this psychological barriers is a huge deal that people have to think about. Okay, Danny Garland, Colonel, I thank you very much.
One last word that actually came up in the discussions with Admiral Crow at SINCPAC.
That very thing?
That very thing was said. And, nothing ever came of that. Vesey was of the same mind. So,
well, thank God we had General Crow or Admiral Crow. Admiral Crow. Yeah. We got Pete Hedges now. How common?
Yeah, I know. It's scary. There's no adult leadership. Period.
None. All right, I got to go, guys. Thanks.
All right. Take care. Thank you, son.
Danny. Can I make a quick comment on that?
Yes, sure.
The comment is this, and again, this is all speculation. Surely. I don't think this is going to be my position. I don't think Donald Trump's going to get the order to attack Iran for a number of reasons. I could go on and on. One of the things, just one of them, is political. We've already seen the reality. So we know that, he's got so much pressure coming from the Senate and of the neocons and all these other Zionists and everybody attack Iran. But I also think I do believe that there are some people in the military who are saying to him, you saw what happened with Yemen, and it ain't gonna be pretty with Iran. And of course, you throw a nuke, and that's it for the U.S. That's it for us. You know what I mean? You're talking about complete economic collapse, and you're the one who ended the United States project, right? That's it. You ended it. It's over. I do believe that Donald Trump's neocon adversaries would love to see Donald Trump attack Iran conventionally for two reasons. Number one, because they want Iran attacked. But number two, because they hate Donald Trump and they understand something politically. Don't get me wrong, I don't agree with the MAGA. I have ideological differences from MAGA. But right now, to be quite frank, MAGA is the only true coherent political movement of note in the United States. There are others that may be burgeoning, but an actual credible political movement that can express itself at the voting booth, can put people in office, can take people out of office. MAGA is this, and it is inextricably tied to the person of Donald Trump. The MAGA people, you've seen Marjorie Taylor Greene and more, say, we do not want a war with Iran. We didn't vote for a war with Iran. We understand what the MAGA people want. You know, MAGA was the Tea Party. Then they started off with, economic issues about the bailouts. They were pissed at, and it kind of more pissed off at that. It kind of morphed into MAGA. So MAGA was, at its heart, an economic movement after 2008. And I think it still is at its heart. The whole America First thing is, what about us? Why is all this? You're doing all of these things. What about us? That's the America First MAGA movement. And they're screaming at the top of their lungs, Michael Flynn, on and on. Donald Trump, we didn't vote for this. I think the neocons that hate Donald Trump know one thing for sure they will get, and that is they will end the ties between MAGA and Donald Trump if he starts, because you get two things. If he starts a war, if he attacks conventionally, if he attacks Iran, you get, doggone it, we didn't vote for this. Number two, let's go the easy way of it, okay? Iran closes the Straits of Hormuz. There's not all of these deaths and everything, but Iran closes the Straits of Hormuz. Well, how's it going to work out when we're paying $13, $15 a gallon for oil? We're still going to get economic collapse and probably hyperinflation as a result of that. So the bottom line is that would be the quickest way they could end MAGA. They don't really give a crap about our economy or any of that other stuff. I've got a book right here called Ally versus Ally, where Tony Blinken has pretty much said in there, we don't really care about the business thing. This is all geopolitical to us. So I think the bonus for the neocons is they would get to destroy MAGA. They would get to take MAGA away from Trump. They would get to isolate Trump, and then politically they'd tear him to shreds.
Colonel Wilkerson, I just
Good,
in the
good
last
assessment, Garland. Good assessment.
In the last 5-10 minutes, actually, I'll just outline my position and get your reactions to it, and then we can close the program. With respect to my audience, I think one thing that is being identified here that you made reference to, Colonel Wilkerson, actually, is that there is some injustice with regard to the law that Scott so eloquently laid out as kind of a realist position that indeed Iran is part of the NPT, and the NPT has these stipulations that Iran must follow. But of course, through these negotiations, I think what has been consistently exposed is that Iran is doing, and Scott is 100% correct here, everything it can to come to a deal, as it has many times before with the United States, and for many different reasons, especially sanctions relief. But at the same time, there is a principle too that I think a lot of people who watch the show uphold, which is, and I agree with this position, and I also agree with Iran's position. The position is that Iran should have the right to defend itself by any means if it is under the threat of attack, that is its right as a sovereign state. However, Iran takes a very hard position against nuclear weapons proliferation and development, which leaves it within this very, I think, contradictory and also precarious position as a nation that is under siege and under attack, which is it has to defend itself, but also it has to ensure that it is complying and following the policies that it says it is going to follow. And it also has to do that with the threat of Israel constantly wanting to strike with the United States' help, of course, primarily with the United States' help. So all of this is to say, Colonel Wilkerson, your reaction to this, given that this comes all in the context of the situation in the entire region where the United States and, of course, it's, as you call it, it's attack dog Israel, are wreaking havoc and are the principal reason why we're even having this discussion in the first place, because there is a design for the entire region that not only includes the complete immiseration of the Palestinian people, but really the subjugation of the region to these two powers, these two. So your reaction to all of this as we come to a close here?
Well, that's a pretty good summation, I think. Actually, there's another element to it that's truly disturbing, and Gaza highlights it, but Iran also highlights it. And in the way you ask the question, it highlights it. We have single-handedly, now there are others who've contributed in the world, but they weren't leaders of the movement in the first place. We have single-handedly taken down the structure we built painstakingly in the world that we call euphemistically international law. And it composes international humanitarian law. It composes the ICJ, the ICC, the whole Hague complex. It composes the Court of Arbitration and everything that in the United Nations, everything that we built since Nuremberg in World War II, Geneva Conventions, the Helsinki Accord, all the things that we've done ostensibly, and I think there was a good portion of them that actually was for the benefit of humanity, not just Americans, but for everyone on the globe. We have disassembled that. We have destroyed it. We're in the process of putting the coup d'etat to it, the coup de grace, rather, to it. We're in the process of being the empire that destroyed everything that it tried painstakingly to build over the last half century plus. And it's reflected in all of these things, from the fact that Albanese had to say, why is the United States not disciplining that state in the eastern end of the Mediterranean that thinks it can go out in the high seas and capture anyone that threatens its interests, no matter where they are or what they're doing, not even if they're trying to bring humanitarian aid to a beleaguered, genocidal, affected population in Gaza. This is a disaster. And what we were talking about with regard to Central Command and the possible use of a nuclear weapon would just be the icing on the cake, if you will, with regard to this, because we are single-handedly disassembling everything that we put together that was positive, and as I said, not just positive for us, but positive for the globe since World War II. That is a crime of the first order. It is a crime that is punishable by life in prison or capital punishment. I mean, yeah, and the world probably, if it survives this crime, is going to take care of us. But we need to recognize what we've done and to begin to try, at least, to put some things right. And there are all manner of places where we can try, but the place we need to try the hardest and the quickest and the most successfully, if possible, is with Israel, because that has ruined the entire apparatus we set up. Talk about a state for whom George Washington, for example, would say exemplifies the fact that I said you shouldn't put all your eggs in another state's basket. It's just, to me, it's not explicable. I just don't understand it. I never have understood it, frankly. I understand the money, and I understand that Israel's really doing, as you implied in your question, our mission over there. And Lindsey Graham said it most accurately. You know, if we weren't killing those people, if Israel weren't killing those people, we'd have to be over there doing it. But I'm not Lindsey Graham. And I don't think most Americans are Lindsey Graham, thank God. And yet we're letting it happen. We are letting it happen. I agree with Scott that something needs to wake the American people up. Something needs to put some life in this democracy. Something needs to come around that gets the American people to object to what's happening in their name. I don't see it happening. I don't see it happening. And that's my greatest concern with this whole business, whether it be Ukraine, the Middle East, or wherever.
Garland, close us out.
Well, I think one of the things that we have to consider with the disaster that we're in is that in a lot of ways, they're all directly related to the U.S. economic collapse. That right now, I mean, look, when you get to the point where you're paying your credit cards with your credit cards, you've already collapsed. You're already broke, 2 times down. And that's where we are. And I think what's happening now, I agree with some part of what Colonel Wilkerson said. For sure, we set up an economic infrastructure after World War II, and for sure, we're trying to tear, we're actually, whether we're trying to or not, we're tearing it down, and we're tearing it down because it doesn't work for us. But it's not that it doesn't work for us. Our economic policies couldn't work under any economic infrastructure if you're just going to go around spending money on every, spending all the money that you want, buying anything you want, and just borrowing more. There is no economic infrastructure that will continue to support that. We were living in a way that was unsustainable, and I believe that all of this is directly related, whether it's Ukraine or what have you. The United States sees its economy going to hell, and so they're like, well, our economy is going to crap, but China's doing pretty good. We got to stop them. Well, why do we have to stop them? Because ours is going to crap, and we're afraid that whatever they've decided to do the way they're doing, it's working, and we're not. So now we have to go after China. Well, what else? Well, we're afraid Russia. They're rising. They're getting stronger. We see other people who aren't. Regardless of what China or Russia does, they're not debtor nations. We are so far past being a debtor nation. I don't even know a word I could use when you're $36 trillion in debt. And you're so stupid that your plan is to add another $20 trillion in debt. That's the way you're going to fix $36 trillion in debt. So the bottom line is this: we're sinking fast. And all of these, to me, it's kind of like a dying man. A guy falls overboard, he's drowning, and he's just reaching in every direction, trying to grab and pull and hold on to anything he can to pull himself out. Maybe China, maybe Russia, maybe Iran, wherever in the hell we can reach. And I think this is just a manifestation of the economic collapse, which is turning into a moral collapse, a political internal collapse. Instead of being able to deal with the fact that we have protests and riots, the governor and the mayor is fighting with the president, and everybody's using it not to address the fact that we got an issue right here that has to be dealt with for, first and foremost, the safety of the people and the businesses living in the area. No, they got to fight it out about who's right and who's wrong and who can score political points. We have an internal political collapse going on when you can't address the simple safety issues in a reasonable way, and instead everything is a fight between the two parties or between, Trump and whoever. I think that's what we're looking at, and it's manifesting itself in Iran or Russia or China or whoever the hell we're mad at, blaming for our own demise.
And
Well,
Danny,
I think that's
Danny, let me just one little thought.
Sure.
I agree with everything Garland just said, and I would say, and we are the only empire in human history to go this way in 5,000 years that has the technological capability to destroy the world.
Yep. Yeah, I would say that this is a really good place to end because it sends home, I think, the right message of where all of this is coming from and, of course, where all of this is going. Everybody, we're going to head out together. So before I do, I want to thank everyone who gave a super chat. Sparky, I'm sorry I didn't get to this question. Please do ask it again and during another stream. Thank you so much to all those who gave super chats here. And I want to also, of course, thank Garland and Colonel Wilkerson for joining me today, and Scott, who had to leave for another endeavor. You can find all the links in the video description where you can follow their work. Garland's YouTube channel is there. Scott's Substack is there. Colonel Wilkerson, you can find him all around on all of the programs, giving his good and very important insights. And, of course, you can find all the places to support this channel, Patreon, Substack, and much more, also in the video description. Without further ado, everybody, we're going to head out. I'll be back tomorrow with Alistair Crook at 11 a.m. Eastern, as well as a bonus panel, which will be announced later in the show. So without further ado, Colonel Wilkerson or Garland, any final words before we head out? All right. We are good here. All right. Well, take care, everyone. See you at 11 a.m. Eastern tomorrow. I'll be sure to get that out soon. Bye-bye.